Have you ever wondered what it takes for someone to confront their own biases and truly change? Sometimes it's a single moment, a quiet exchange, a subtle comment that sets everything into motion. In this story, we meet Heather Simmons, a polished and experienced flight attendant who has always prided herself on professionalism. But when a seemingly routine flight brings her face-to-face with Elijah Johnson, a thoughtful 14-year-old boy traveling with his mother, Heather makes a small comment, a subtle slight that carries far more weight than she realizes. What happens when the family she inadvertently hurts turns out to have a connection to her career that she never saw coming? Will Heather take responsibility for her actions and grow from this experience? Or will the consequences prove too much to handle? This is a story of redemption, accountability, and the quiet strength of a young boy who teaches a seasoned professional the value of empathy. If you're ready to explore a journey of personal growth and transformation, stick around. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Now let's dive in. Heather Simmons adjusted the scarf around her neck, catching her reflection in the glass wall of JFK's Terminal 5. The muted navy blue uniform fit her like a glove, its tailored lines cutting a sharp silhouette against the chaos of the airport. Her blonde hair, pinned into a flawless bun, hadn't moved since she'd secured it that morning. It was a face and demeanor that Heather had perfected over 13 years in the airline industry. She liked to think of herself as efficient, composed a woman who could keep calm in the most turbulent skies. Control, she thought, is everything. The day began as so many others had, a quick briefing with her fellow flight attendants, a scan of the passenger manifest, and the usual rounds of small talk in the galley. Flight 427 to Los Angeles would be another full flight, packed with families, solo travelers, and business people trying to outpace the ticking clock. It was exactly what Heather expected. And that was just how she liked it. As she strode toward Gate 32, her sharp eyes swept across the crowd. The boarding area buzzed with the typical pre-flight energy, parents corralling restless children, travelers jockeying for position in the ever-confusing line system, and the faint hum of announcements blending into the air. Heather's gaze landed on a young boy standing with a woman near the priority boarding sign. He looked about 14, his posture stiff, as though he were unsure of where to stand or how to hold himself. His dark brown skin and neatly combed hair framed a face that was both youthful and serious. His hands fiddled with the edge of his tie, the kind of accessory most kids his age would have left at home. Beside him stood his mother, dressed in a long skirt and a modest headscarf that Heather recognized as religious attire. The woman had a calm, steady demeanor, her hand lightly resting on her son's shoulder. Heather's eyes lingered for a second longer than necessary before she turned away. It wasn't that the pair stood out so much as the faint sense of unfamiliarity they sparked in her. She told herself it was nothing, just the weariness of another long shift. But her jaw tightened as she moved toward the gate agents. Elijah Johnson hated airports. It wasn't the noise or the crowds, he could handle those. What he couldn't shake was the way people looked at him. Or didn't. Most travelers walked right past him, their gazes skimming over him like he wasn't there. Others, though, had a way of glancing at him too quickly, as though catching sight of him made them nervous. It wasn't anything overt, but he felt it in the small things. The way someone clutched their bag a little tighter, the way they avoided meeting his eyes. He turned to his mother, Alice, who was busy rearranging their boarding passes in her hands. She always moved with such purpose, like every action was part of a larger plan. Her calm presence steadied him, though he still felt the gnawing tension in his chest. "Mom, do I really have to wear this?" he asked, tugging at his tie. Alice glanced at him and smiled. "It's a family trip, Eli. You know how Grandpa likes us to look our best." "I know, but no one else dresses like this," Elijah muttered, shifting on his feet. "Don't worry about everyone else," she said gently, smoothing his collar. "We're not here for them. We're here to celebrate with our family." Elijah nodded, though the words only eased him a little. He trusted his mother's confidence more than he trusted his own. Heather was stationed just outside the boarding tunnel, her polished smile firmly in place. Passenger interactions were scripted in her mind, a series of polite exchanges she could perform without much thought. "Good morning." "Welcome aboard," she repeated to each traveler, her voice even and professional. When Alice and Elijah stepped forward, she greeted them with the same scripted tone, but her eyes flickered toward Alice's attire, then to Elijah's formal clothes. Something about their presence gave her pause, though she couldn't quite place why. "Welcome aboard," she said, her words a shade brisker than before. Alice nodded, offering a polite smile as she guided Elijah toward the plane. Heather watched them for a moment before returning to the next passenger. The interaction should have slipped from her mind as easily as it had entered, but the unease lingered. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of passengers settling in. Elijah took his seat by the window, feeling both excitement and nervousness at the prospect of takeoff. His mother sat beside him, organizing her belongings with her usual efficiency. As the plane filled, Elijah grew restless. The close quarters, the faint smell of recycled air, it all made his stomach churn. He fidgeted with his seatbelt as his mother noticed his unease. "Do you want me to ask for a pillow?" she asked softly. He nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Alice raised her hand as Heather passed by, her steps measured and deliberate. "Excuse me," Alice began. "Would it be possible to get a pillow for my son? He often feels a bit queasy during takeoff." Heather hesitated, her polite smile dimming. "I'm afraid pillows are reserved for first-class passengers," she replied. "But I can check if there are any extras." Alice nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply. As Heather walked away, Elijah looked down, his cheeks burning. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the interaction left him feeling smaller somehow. Heather returned to her duties, but the request gnawed at her. Something about it had made her uncomfortable, not the request itself, but the way Alice had looked at her, steady and unyielding. Later, as she passed their row again, Alice raised a hand to catch her attention. "Were you able to find a pillow?" Alice asked, her voice calm. Heather shook her head, her tone tight. "Unfortunately, I couldn't. I'll remind you, though, that amenities like that are typically reserved for first-class passengers." She hesitated, then added, "It's also a good idea to dress for comfort during travel, especially for children." The words were out before she could stop them, and as soon as they left her mouth, she regretted them. Alice's gaze didn't waver, but there was a shift in her expression, a quiet disappointment that hit harder than anger would have. Elijah's head snapped up, his wide eyes darting between his mother and Heather. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Alice placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "Thank you for your time," Alice said, her voice calm but firm. She turned back to Elijah, her expression softening as she spoke to him quietly. Heather moved on, but the interaction stuck with her. She told herself she had been polite, professional even. But the tension in her chest suggested otherwise. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane soared through the early afternoon sky. Heather moved through the aisles, checking on passengers and responding to the occasional call button. Yet no matter how she tried to focus, her thoughts kept drifting back to the interaction with Alice and Elijah. Her words, particularly about dressing for comfort, rang in her ears like a whisper that wouldn't fade. She told herself again that it wasn't unkind, it had been an attempt at practicality, hadn't it? But deep down, she knew the comment hadn't come from a place of helpfulness. It was judgment, quiet, subtle, and deeply wrong. Heather shook her head, trying to brush it off. She had a job to do, and passengers were waiting. At row 17, Elijah leaned back against his seat, staring out the window. The world below was a patchwork of clouds and sunlight, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His mother's hand rested lightly on his knee, a silent reassurance he didn't know how to accept. "I'm okay," he muttered, though the tightness in his chest betrayed him. Alice turned to him, her expression soft. "I know you are," she said, "but it's still important to talk about these things when they happen." He didn't reply. Talking about it felt like giving it power, like admitting that the flight attendant's words had mattered. But they did matter. The way she had dismissed them so casually, so politely, as if they were out of place, even asking for something. She probably didn't mean anything by it, Elijah said finally, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Alice tilted her head slightly, studying her son. Whether she meant to or not doesn't change how it felt, does it? Elijah shook his head, Then it's okay to feel hurt, she said gently. By the time Alice and Elijah had exited the plane, Heather had filed the incident away in the back of her mind, convincing herself it was insignificant. She didn't see Alice typing a message on her phone as they waited for their luggage. Derek Johnson read the email late that evening, seated in his office at home. His wife's tone was measured and calm as she described the subtle slights during the flight, but he could feel the undercurrent of frustration in her words. Elijah's response broke my heart, she wrote. He's old enough now to notice these things more than ever. He told me he felt invisible, like she didn't think we belonged there. Derek set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. His jaw tightened. He had dealt with issues like this before in his position as CEO of Transatlantic Airlines, but it was different when it was his own family. He didn't want to overreact, but he also couldn't let it slide. Not when his company had spent years cultivating an image of inclusivity. Not when Elijah, his thoughtful, reserved son, had been made to feel small. Reaching for his tablet, Derek composed a message to HR, CC&G, the training department. His instructions were clear. A review was to be scheduled with the flight attendant involved, and sensitivity training would be mandatory. He paused before sending the email, then added a final note. I'd like to meet with Ms. Simmons myself. The following morning, Heather was scrolling through her tablet when the notification appeared. Performance review, immediate attendance required. Her heart sank. She had never received such a notice in her career. As far as she knew, her record was impeccable. She hurried to the small conference room listed in the email, her mind racing through possibilities. When she entered, the sight of Derek Johnson sitting at the head of the table sent a fresh wave of nerves through her. He was a well-known figure in the company, but she had never met him in person. Ms. Simmons, Derek said, gesturing for her to take a seat. Thank you for coming. Of course, Heather said, her voice steady despite her unease. Derek folded his hands on the table, his expression calm but firm. I'll get straight to the point. My wife and son were passengers on your flight yesterday. They described some interactions with you that I found troubling. Heather blinked, her mind scrambling to piece together what he was referring to. I'm not sure I understand, she said carefully. Derek's gaze remained steady. My son, Elijah, mentioned feeling dismissed and uncomfortable after asking for a small accommodation. My wife described your comments as unnecessary at best and judgmental at worst. The words hit Heather like a sharp wind. Her initial reaction was to defend herself, to explain that she'd been following policy, that her tone had been professional. But Derek's calm, piercing stare held her in place. This isn't about intent, he continued. It's about impact. And the impact of your actions made my family feel unwelcome on one of our planes. Heather's face flushed. Mr. Johnson, I didn't mean to. I believe you didn't mean to, Derek interrupted, his tone still measured. But the fact remains that you did. Heather nodded stiffly, her thoughts racing. I'm offering you two options, Derek said. You can undertake a sensitivity training program and issue a formal apology to my family. Or, if you feel this isn't something you're willing to commit to, you may choose to resign. Heather's chest tightened. Resignation wasn't an option. Not after all the years she had invested in this career. I'll take the training, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek nodded. Good. It won't be easy, but I believe it's necessary. The first session of Heather's training was scheduled for the following week. She spent the days leading up to it in a haze of self-reflection and denial. When she arrived at the training center, she was greeted by Brenda, a facilitator with kind eyes and an approachable demeanor. Welcome, Heather, Brenda said warmly. Thank you for being here. Heather offered a tight smile. She wasn't sure she was ready for whatever this process entailed, but she knew she didn't have a choice. The session began with a simple exercise, identifying moments in her life where she had made assumptions about others based on appearances. Heather struggled at first. She wanted to believe she wasn't the kind of person who judged others unfairly. But as Brenda guided her through the exercise, memories began to surface, small moments where she had drawn conclusions about someone without knowing them, where she had allowed stereotypes to shape her perceptions. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also impossible to ignore. The second session of Heather's training arrived quickly. though to her it felt like the days leading up to it had dragged endlessly. She sat in the quiet room across from Brenda, feeling smaller than she had in years. On the table in front of her lay a worksheet with questions designed to prompt introspection. What do you believe led to the assumptions you made during the flight? Brenda asked, her voice calm but probing. Heather stared at the page for a moment before speaking. I think I've just always been taught to focus on efficiency, to get things done as quickly and smoothly as possible. Maybe I didn't stop to think about how my tone or my choices might come across. Brenda nodded. Efficiency is important, yes. But sometimes, in the rush to be efficient, we overlook something more important: humanity. Heather winced slightly at the word. It wasn't a reprimand, but it carried weight all the same. The session moved on to discussing microaggressions. Brenda explained how seemingly small actions or comments, those that often feel innocuous to the person saying them, could have a cumulative, harmful impact on the person receiving them. You mentioned feeling like you were just doing your job, Brenda said. Can you reflect on how the passengers you interacted with might have interpreted your actions differently? Heather hesitated. Her mind went back to Elijah's face when she had dismissed Alice's request for a pillow. He had looked startled, almost like he was bracing for something. And Alice's expression, that quiet, unwavering disappointment, lingered in her memory. I think I made them feel like they didn't belong, Heather admitted quietly. The words felt heavy in her throat, but she knew they were true. Back at home, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden surface. Across from him, Alice sipped a cup of tea, her gaze steady but gentle. Are you still thinking about what happened on the flight? She asked softly. Elijah shrugged, but his silence said more than words could. Alice reached across the table, placing a hand over his. You don't have to brush it off, Eli. It's okay to feel upset. I just don't get why people do that, he said finally. We weren't bothering anyone. It's not like I asked for something crazy. Just a pillow. Alice nodded. Sometimes people make judgments without realizing it. It doesn't make it right, but it happens. That's why it's important for us to call it out when we see it. Elijah frowned. But what's the point? It's not like one conversation can change someone's mind. Alice smiled faintly. You'd be surprised. Sometimes people don't even realize they're carrying those biases until they're confronted with them. And when they do, it can open the door for change. 2 weeks later, Heather found herself standing outside the Johnsons' home, a modest but inviting house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. She clutched a folder containing notes from her training sessions, though she wasn't sure she'd need them. The door opened, and Alice greeted her with a polite but guarded smile. Ms. Simmons, thank you for coming. Thank you for having me, Heather replied, stepping inside. Elijah was sitting on the living room sofa, his expression curious but cautious. Heather felt a pang of guilt as she met his gaze. He was just a kid, a thoughtful, quiet kid who had been hurt by her thoughtlessness. She sat down across from him and Alice, taking a deep breath. I want to start by saying I'm sorry, Heather began, her voice steady despite her nerves. What I said on the flight and the way I handled your request was wrong. I didn't think about how my words might affect you, and I made you feel unwelcome. That's not the kind of person I want to be, and it's not the kind of flight attendant I want to be. Elijah nodded slightly, but didn't speak. Heather glanced at Alice, who was watching her intently. I've been going through training to help me better understand these kinds of situations, Heather continued. It's opened my eyes to how small actions can have a big impact, and I'm committed to doing better, not just for you, but for every passenger I serve. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then Elijah spoke. Thanks for saying that, he said, his voice soft but clear. I guess it just felt like you didn't see me, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Heather's chest tightened. I'm so sorry, Elijah. That was never my intention, but I understand now that intention isn't enough. I want to make sure no one ever feels that way because of me again. Alice nodded, her expression thoughtful. Accountability is important, Miss Simmons. It's how we move forward. Thank you for taking this step. Heather left the house feeling lighter, but more determined than ever. She had made a mistake, but she was finally beginning to understand how to make amends. When Heather returned to work, she carried a renewed sense of purpose. The things she had once taken for granted, her tone, her assumptions, her approach to passengers, were now points of reflection. On her next flight, she made a conscious effort to engage with passengers more thoughtfully. When a young woman nervously asked if there were extra snacks available, Heather responded with genuine warmth, ensuring the woman felt heard. The shift didn't go unnoticed. Carla, a fellow flight attendant, commented during their break, "You seem different lately." In a good way. Heather smiled faintly. "I've just been trying to think more about the little things. They matter more than I realized." At school, Elijah was beginning to feel more confident. The experience on the flight had left a mark, but so had the way his parents had handled it with strength and grace. When his debate team announced the topic for their next competition, the power of empathy in leadership, Elijah knew exactly what he wanted to say. Standing at the podium, he spoke about his experience on the flight, framing it as a lesson in how small actions could either harm or uplift. "Empathy isn't just about understanding someone else's feelings," he said. "It's about choosing to act in a way that shows you value them, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard." The applause that followed was thunderous, and for the first time, Elijah felt like his voice truly mattered. Heather's new approach to her work became more evident with each flight. She was no longer the curt, distant professional she had been, but someone who saw the people behind the requests. On a red-eye from Chicago to Denver, she noticed a young man struggling with his overhead luggage. He wore a hoodie and had earbuds in, and his slight frame barely managed to lift the heavy suitcase. Heather stepped forward, offering a hand. "Here, let me help," she said, smiling. The young man hesitated but nodded. "Thanks," he muttered, pulling out one earbud. As she helped him settle the bag, Heather asked, "Is this your first time flying?" "Yeah," he said, glancing around nervously. "I'm headed to see my sister. She just had a baby." Heather nodded. "Congratulations. Let us know if you need anything during the flight, okay?" For the rest of the journey, Heather noticed the young man relax in his seat, his initial tension fading. The interaction stayed with her, proof that small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways she hadn't fully appreciated before. Meanwhile, Elijah's success on the debate team had sparked something in him. For years, he had preferred to stay in the background, avoiding attention. But now he was beginning to realize the value of his voice. At home, his parents encouraged him to channel that confidence into other areas of his life. Alice often reminded him, "Your voice can make a difference, Eli. Don't be afraid to use it." He decided to run for student council. It was a decision that surprised even him, but he felt ready for the challenge. His platform focused on inclusion and creating a better sense of belonging for all students. During his campaign speech, he stood in front of the entire school, his palms sweating, but his words clear. "Sometimes, people don't see you for who you are. They see you for what they expect you to be," Elijah said. "But we can change that by showing up for each other, by being the kind of people who listen, who care, and who act." The applause that followed was the loudest he had ever heard, and for the first time, Elijah felt like he belonged. Heather's journey of self-improvement didn't stop with her own reflection. Inspired by the training she had undergone, she proposed an inclusivity workshop for her fellow flight attendants. The idea was met with mixed reactions at first. Some of her colleagues appreciated the initiative, while others viewed it as unnecessary. "I don't think I've ever had a complaint," Carla said during one of their breaks. "Why should I sit through training for something I haven't done?" Heather smiled gently. "It's not about blame, Carla. It's about growth. Even if we think we're doing fine, there's always room to be better." Carla frowned, but didn't argue further. The workshop launched a month later, with Heather co-leading the first session. She shared her story, carefully omitting personal details about Elijah and his family, focusing instead on what she had learned. "I used to think I treated everyone the same," Heather said to the group. "But I've realized that treating everyone the same isn't the same as treating them with the respect and care they deserve as individuals." By the end of the session, even the skeptics in the room seemed more reflective. Heather felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Months later, Heather found herself assigned to another cross-country flight. As passengers boarded, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Elijah, now taller and more confident, was traveling with his family again. When their eyes met, Heather smiled warmly. "Elijah, it's good to see you again." Elijah returned her smile, his posture relaxed. "Hi, Miss Simmons. You've been doing okay?" "Better than okay," Heather said. How about you? Still debating? Elijah grinned. Yeah, I'm even running for student council. That's fantastic, Heather said, her pride in him evident. As the flight continued, Heather couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Elijah's confidence and warmth were a testament to his family's strength and a reminder of her own journey. Derek and Alice had been following Heather's progress quietly, impressed by her dedication to change. Derek invited her to accompany events celebrating new initiatives, including the inclusivity training program Heather had helped implement. During the event, Derek spoke about the airline's commitment to building a culture of respect and empathy. Heather sat in the audience, feeling a mix of humility and pride as he highlighted the impact of her efforts. Later, Alice approached her, extending a hand. You've come a long way, Miss Simmons. Thank you for putting in the work. Heather shook her hand, her voice steady. Thank you for giving me the chance to grow. Years later, Heather stood in a crowded conference room at Transatlantic Airlines headquarters. The inclusivity program she had helped establish was celebrating its 5th anniversary, and Elijah, now a civil rights attorney, was the keynote speaker. As Elijah took the stage, his voice carried the same quiet strength Heather had first glimpsed years ago. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said. It happens when people make the choice to listen, to learn, and to act. It happens when we see each other not for what we assume, but for who we are. Heather felt a swell of pride as she listened, knowing she had been part of that journey. The event ended with a quiet moment between them. Thanks for everything, Elijah said, shaking her hand. No, Heather replied, her eyes bright. Thank you. The story of Heather Simmons, Elijah Johnson, and the Johnson family reminds us of the power of humility, reflection, and change. Heather's transformation was not immediate, but her willingness to learn and grow created a ripple effect that reshaped her workplace and touched the lives of those around her. Elijah's quiet strength became a beacon of hope for a brighter, more inclusive future. If you've enjoyed this journey of redemption, accountability, and empathy, don't forget to show your support. Please like this story, share it with others who might benefit from its message, and subscribe to our channel for more content that inspires, uplifts, and explores the depth of human connection. Your engagement helps us create stories that matter. Thank you for reading, and remember, small actions can lead to big changes. Let's continue to see, value, and respect one another one interaction at a time.